I really liked the concept. It was really an interesting concept. However, the big caveat of this book is that it is just so incredibly campy, like to the max, to the point where it's really cringy at a lot of places. There is a musical number in here, and it's not great. Hi, I'm Kat, and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where I like to talk about books and ideas, and today I'm going to tell you about the fiction books that I finished in October. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I have about 8 books here. I think that these are all fantasy. I think I have one contemporary romance, but the rest of them are fantasy. And it was a bit of a mixed reading month. I had some that I really loved. I had some that I was kind of middling about. And then I had my second fiction DNF of the year. So yeah, I'm going to tell you about all of those books now. So the first book I have to talk about is the contemporary romance. We'll just go on and start with that one. This is You Again. So this book follows our two main characters. One is Ari, who's living in New York City, and she's an aspiring comedian, but she mostly works a lot of service jobs in order to supplement her very meager income. And our other character is Josh, who is a chef, and he is trying to escape the legacy of his family's deli and be known for a more high class of food. And the first time they kind of officially meet, it's when he is dating Ari's roommate, and they meet. They don't really hit it off very well. They don't really like each other to begin with, and then through a series of coincidences over the next 8 years, they run into each other around New York and have varying forms of encounters, hostile to almost not hostile. When our story kind of starts, they're both at low points in their lives, and they meet by coincidence, and they kind of strike up a friendship. And so we have a kind of hate to friends to lovers sort of dynamic through this whole thing. So I really enjoyed this book. It felt very messy, but in a good way. It felt like it was written to be a 2010s rom-com, even though it takes place in 2023, and it was just really fun to read. I really enjoyed the characterization of the characters. Josh really had a stick up his ass, and Ari was just kind of a hot mess, and they worked with each other, but they were also both flawed people, and not in a kind of superficially flawed way, but they both made what were reasonable decisions to them and to their characters, but that were objectively wrong in the situations. And this obviously drives wedges between them and whatever. And so it was just, I think, a very genuine characterization and very good. I think it would also be good for this time of year. It takes place over many years and many seasons, but there are definitely some key autumnal and winter scenes, and so New York in the end of the year, and I would imagine that might be very atmospheric for some people. So yeah, if you're looking for a fun, angsty rom-com to pick up in the next few months, I'd highly recommend this one. This next one I won't spend too much time on because this is a sequel to one I read last month, and this is Woven by Gold, which is the sequel to Bonded by Thorns by Elizabeth Helen. This book, the first one, followed Rosalina, who is a human woman living in the human world, and she travels through an enchanted forest to a castle where her father is being kept prisoner, and she swaps herself as the prisoner, a la Beauty and the Beast, and realizes that at this castle there's not only one cursed prince, there are 4 of them, and it's a Why Choose Beauty and the Beast retelling. And I say those words to you, and you can probably figure out what's going to happen in this series. But I found the first one really fun. I think it was really well done. I really liked Rosalina's characterization. I think she's written as the perfect kind of relatable character for the book girlies who grew up reading fantasy and always loved books and romance. But I'm having a really good time with this series. There are the 4 princes, and they're cursed to turn into wolves at night until they find their true love. And in this second book, there is a curse or something. There's a frost moving in on the autumn court, and the winter prince is not behind it, and so they all go to the autumn court to figure out what the hell's going on, and so they have to solve that mystery and whatever. So yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with this one. I think last month I said that the first book reminded me a lot of ACOTAR, and I stand by that. I don't think it's a ripoff to any degree, but I think that there's a lot of similarities to ACOTAR. So if you were a fan of ACOTAR-like romantasy, but you like Why Choose, I would recommend this one. So getting into the second DNF I have of the year, I think second fiction DNF, this is The Gods Below by Andrea Stewart, and this I was very surprised that I ended up DNFing it. Basically, I thought I would like this a lot more than I ended up doing, and I don't think there was anything wrong with the story, it was just the construction. So anyway, let's talk about this. So this is very complex. I don't want to get too far into like what all is happening in the world. So basically in this fantasy world, before the story starts, humans cut down all of these magical trees to feed into their machines to like make stuff, and they decimated all the trees, and that ended up angering the gods. And so now there's basically a war between the humans and the gods, except not all of the gods. A lot of the gods run around and like are enemies of the humans, and there are god killers and stuff. And then those god killers for some reason worship one of the gods who is like also involved in this war and almost pitting the two sides against each other. It's very strange. So I think that the god who's kind of pitting the two sides against each other is called Clune. And basically what's happening is that he is sort of restoring the land a bit by bit as he goes. And so he will come into like an area of this fantasy land, and he will basically sweep it over with magic and restore it. But in order to do that, he has to kill half of the people who live there. And so whenever he like one of these waves of magic comes, half of the people disappear, and then the other half get altered. So there are interesting themes obviously of like environmentalism. And so the story starts, just talked a lot about like the world building and stuff, but the story starts with these two sisters, and they end up on opposite sides of a border, and one of them ends up getting altered, so she gets stuck in this place that's like had this magic wave go over it, and so she gets stuck on that side, and then the other sister gets stuck on the other side and ends up working in this mine where she has to dive for god gems, which are then fed to Clune for reasons to like make him stronger or something, so he can then exact this justice on the world. It's kind of confusing. I don't think that the like whole premise and the setup and all the gods and everything were like too confusing. I got it, it's just a lot to explain. But the thing that I think got me with this is that we started with these two sisters, we're kind of going back and forth between them, they're stuck on opposite sides of the border, that's cool. And then we start getting new POVs. And I DNF'd this about 200 pages in. So 200 pages in, we had gotten 5 POVs, 2 from the sisters and then 3 from other people, one of whom was in another like time in the past. And so it was just a lot happening, and the other thing was that none of these POVs really overlapped. I assume that they're all going to come together by the end of this book, and they're all kind of like unknowingly working towards a plot. But it kept feeling with every new POV that I was restarting another book and getting to know new POV characters, but also all the characters around them. And because they're not overlapping with each other, there's just a lot to keep track of. They're in all these different places. They're all, you know, having their own little stories that, again, I assume are all going to come together, but it was just like a lot to keep track of, and there wasn't enough to really get invested in one character, because as soon as you got invested into that character and whatever they were up to, we got a new POV and a new story that was happening that we had to like, you know, care about and pay attention to and whatever. And so it was just a bit too much to do all at once. I think that if the author had started with like the two sisters and then like maybe one more POV and worked their way through the book that way, and then like if this was a series, you can then introduce more POVs. But I think that like in the first 200 pages, which is about the first third of this book, in the first third to introduce 5 different POVs who are all in different places is just a lot to keep track of, and you're asking a lot of a reader who is not already invested in this world. So yeah, that was, I think, the problem I had with this. I just felt like I was forcing myself through this, and so while I liked the themes and it was just kind of interesting and it was very, I think, creative, but just the too many characters to keep track of too soon, and I just didn't want to bother. I don't think any of them were like compelling enough that I was just like, I really want to know what's going to happen to you, and that's enough for me to keep reading this book. So yeah, that's what happened with this. So I'm very disappointed. I thought I would like this more, but hopefully when I give it away at the end of the year, someone else will find it and love it. The next book we have here is another one that I found slightly disappointing, but I did finish it, and that is The Half King by Melissa Landers. So this is a romantasy, and the premise of this is that in this kingdom there are 5 main noble families, and they're all cursed because 1,000 years ago their ancestors conspired to kill the goddess, and the goddess cursed them. And so there are various ways these curses manifest, but usually it impacts the firstborn of someone descended from this line. And then often secondborns in any many of these families get given to the temples which worship the goddess. And so Cerise, who is our main character, was given to the temple. She was raised in the temple, and her goal, her like hope, is that she will become an oracle one day, and that is supposed to come on her claiming day, her 21st birthday. She is supposed to like get the powers of sight. So she's living in the temple, and the Reverend Mother has this vision of Cerise in the capital, in the palace, as like an envoy to the king from the temple. And so Cerise is basically shipped off to the palace to be this envoy, to be the kind of representation of the temple in the palace. And the Reverend Mother thinks that this vision is a sign that Cerise is going to be the one to break the curse that is on these 5 families. And Cerise has a personal interest in this because her sister is pregnant, and if her sister has this child, the child will likely be cursed, and so she wants her niece or nephew not to be cursed. So she goes to the palace with the goal of breaking the curse, and at the palace, one of the people that she meets is the king, who is also cursed, and his curse is that he basically turns into shadow at night, and that is why he's called the Half King. And this is also eaten into some of his waking hours as well, so it's not really great, and basically he's going to disappear on his 21st birthday. So there's a lot going on. The basic premise of this is Cerise and some people at the palace trying to figure out a way to break the curse on all of these families and save the kingdom, because there's a lot of other like political stuff that's going to happen if the king disappears forever. I think the most interesting thing about this book was the religious themes. There was this priesthood who were very misogynistic. They had these ridiculous rules about women and women having any kind of power, but particularly women of the temple having any kind of sexual autonomy. They were very puritanical and misogynistic and didn't like the thought of specifically women of the temple having like sexy thoughts and stuff. And so when Cerise, who is this woman of the temple, and she's trying to be very good and pure and whatever, gets to the palace and she starts having sexy thoughts about the king, she gets some flack from some of the priests about like being sinful and stuff. And these kinds of themes are very personal for the author. It's in the author's note about like, you know, why she wrote the book this way. And so while all that was like interesting kind of as a concept, it was also not particularly revelatory. We've seen this kind of thing before in history and also in books, and like there wasn't anything particularly special about it. It was just like your bog standard asshole priests. So it was kind of a bit meh, and I imagine that if you did grow up with a religious upbringing, especially one that had very puritanical views on sex, you might connect with this a bit more as, you know, something that the main character was struggling with. But it kind of felt like, yes, I agree with you. These priests are assholes. They're wrong about stuff. Whatever. I don't really care though, because it's just, you know, old news, it felt like. And so that was one thing. I think the other things about this that kind of got me was, one, the age of the characters. It felt very YA. The characters were like 20, 21, but they still felt really young. And I think some of that was compounded by the fact that Cerise is this like caricature of a perfect, wonderful, demure, chaste young lady who grew up in a temple. She's very sheltered. She's very caring and loving of everyone. And like, that's all wonderful. She's like a little fairy princess. And the only sort of flaw she has is that she feels like sexy feelings for the king. And that's, you know, wrong under this contrived, dumb, religious, patriarchal rule. So because that was her only character flaw, she just felt a bit too perfect, and it wasn't something that I feel like a lot of people could probably connect with, unless of course you had that similar experience that she felt of like, you know, religious sexual repression. But yeah, she just wasn't particularly interesting as a character, so I had a hard time kind of connecting with her. And additionally, this is a romantasy, so like the romance is supposed to be important here. It just felt very insta-lovey, and also a lot of the magic felt very convenient, and a lot of like the things that were happening, it just felt way too convenient all the time for everything. And so it was like the author had an idea of what the story was going to be and just kind of like made it happen without really putting in the foundation that it needed for it to be believable. It just felt like all the characters were little puppets doing whatever the author wanted. A lot of it just felt very contrived. So yeah, this was kind of meh. I didn't particularly enjoy it. It's the first book in a series. I don't feel a need to continue on with the series. So kind of disappointed in this, and that was that. So the next book we have here is one that I had actually really mixed feelings about. I'm not sure if I love it or if I hate it. I think it's a bit of both for different reasons. So this is Long Live Evil by Sarah Rees Brennan. In the story, we are following Ray. She is unfortunately dying of cancer, and she is living in a hospital, and one of the only comforts she has is reading her favorite fantasy series with her sister. And so the series is called Time of Iron, and it's this sweeping epic fantasy. At one point, she wakes up in her hospital room, and there's a woman beside her bed who tells her if she wants to live, she can actually go into the fantasy series and find this flower, the flower of life and death, and if she finds it, she'll get out of the book and it'll also cure her of her cancer. And she's like, okay, well, this is weird, but it beats chemo, so let's try it. And so she's transported into the series, and she wakes up in the body of one of the characters, but oh no, it's actually one of the villains. And she knows, because she's read the series, that this villain is destined to die soon, and so she has to figure out how she can not die before the flower of life and death blooms, which is like, it's gonna bloom in like a month, so she has to wait till then, but she has to stay alive until then. And so she starts playing the court politics and stuff. So not only does she have to save herself from death, but also she has to survive long enough and also not like interfere too much with the characters in the book. She doesn't want to upset the way that the story unfolds. And so it's a really interesting sort of look into like the politics and the court intrigue, and also like the fact that she's around a bunch of fictional characters. And I really liked the concept. It was really an interesting concept. However, the big caveat of this book is that it is just so incredibly campy, like to the max, to the point where it's really cringy at a lot of places. There is a musical number in here, and it's not great. So I really like the concept of this story, the going into the fantasy book, even the fact that the fantasy book is this very stereotypical sweeping epic fantasy, but like where all the characters seem like caricatures. I was actually okay with all of that until Ray gets there, and she is pretending to be one of the characters, and she realizes she's a villain, and she just leans into this real hard, and it becomes just so super campy and so over the top, to the point where you're just, you know, when you're like watching a movie and the characters on screen are doing something really outlandish and you're just like, this isn't how people actually act, and you're watching through your fingers. That's what it felt like for a lot of this, and I had to like put the book down because of the amount of cringe. But at the same time, like I wanted to keep going. I wanted to see what would happen, and so there was something about it where like I want to know what's going to happen. It wasn't cringy enough for me to like stop reading it permanently, but it was enough for me to stop reading it in that moment. So yeah, there was a lot going on here, and her character, her like villain persona, reminded me of that episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer where Harmony is a vampire and she gets like some minions to go around Buffy's house and kill her, and she's like, okay minions, we're gonna go do some evil now. That's what it felt like. That's literally like the vibes that we had, especially at the beginning of this book. It was just way over the top. So that was just like, that was a stylistic choice that I did not love in this, and I've heard other people complain about that as well. And like, I think I can do campiness and cringiness if it's in like small doses in a book, but I think if it's like in the amount it wasn't here, it just ruins the entire enjoyment. Another thing that really took me out of this book was the fact that obviously the main character is traveling into a book. She is then surrounded by fictional characters, but she keeps reminding us that they are fictional characters and that like if something bad happens to them, it's okay because like they're not real. But I'm just like, part of loving fantasy, or, you know, books or fiction in general, part of loving books is that you feel for these characters who you know are fictional, but you feel like they're real characters. Otherwise, we wouldn't cry when our favorite character dies or something like that. So the fact that, like, you're a fan of this series, but you keep reminding me that actually they're all fictional, and so it's okay, it doesn't matter. It was weird, and it kept taking me out of the story, because I'm just like, I don't want you, a fictional character, to remind me about the other fictional characters. I'm trying to get absorbed in the book here. There are parts of it that I did not like, but then there are other parts, the kind of concept of the story, but also the fact that she is trying not to impact the story too much, but of course, like, she sort of learns that these characters are not just cardboard cutouts, and she can't just manipulate them. So that was a fun thing to see her wrestle with. So yeah, I don't really know who this book is for. If you can stand cringiness, if you're cool with that, then I'd highly recommend this. I think that I will continue on with the series because the ending was tops. I was very surprised by the ending in a pleasant way, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. Let's see where this goes. So I'm glad I read on till the end. But on the other hand, I could have done without the cringiness, and I'm really hoping because of the way it ended, that like maybe we will see less of that over the top feeling in the next book. I feel like I am back at When the Moon Hatched, and there's like, there's so many things about that book I really did not like, but like there was one element that was just like, okay, I see where you're going, and you're hoping it will be better in the next book, so I don't know, but yeah, it was a mix, but I'm tentatively here for it. However, this is like a 3-star, maybe, because of the cringiness. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this. It was both good and bad in a lot of ways. Okay, so now we're getting some books that I actually really liked, decisively liked, and so yeah, we've got 3 left. So the first one is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This is a booktube, book talk, bookstagram, book internet darling. Everyone freaking loves this book. It is not a romantasy. I feel like I see it recommended as a romantasy a lot, and I think that maybe the later books get into that, but this is a just like straight up fantasy. It's YA, and it's kind of like political intrigue more than anything. So in this book, we are following Jude. Jude is a human, and before Jude was born, her mother lived in Fairy, which is where the Fae live, and was married to this Fae man, person, whatever, called Mordock, but she didn't really get on there, and so she faked her death and escaped with her daughter Vivi, who is Jude's older sister, and then her mom finds Jude's father, and then they have Jude and her other sister Taryn. So Jude has 2 sisters, and they're all living in the human world, and then one day when Jude is like 10 years old, Mordock comes to the door and is basically pretty pissed that his wife ran off with his child, and so he kills Jude's mother and Jude's father, and then takes all 3 of the sisters to the human world. Even though Jude and her sister Taryn are not like his children, he takes them all to be raised in Fairy. So that was only chapter 1, and then we fast forward a few years to Jude being in her like late teens, and she has been a human who's lived in the Fae realm pretty much her kind of like memorable life. And so when the main story starts, Jude is kind of trying to figure out what her place is going to be in the Fae realm, because she doesn't really want to return to the human world. And that is made more difficult by the fact that there is an asshole prince in her class who is bullying her. I have to admit, when I first heard the premise of this book, I was a bit like, ugh, bully stuff. I can't. I don't like in books when like one of the characters is a bully for no good reason and like ends up getting redeemed. I wouldn't say that Carden ended up getting redeemed at the end of this, but I found that I can more stand that sort of behavior in a fantasy where it's coming from a non-human character than in a contemporary book where it's coming from a human. So that might be part of it, but I did find I quite like this. I like the political themes, I like the world that Holly Black built, I like Jude as a character, and just like the way she handled the things that were coming at her. I thought it was very interesting. I wanted to keep reading to figure out like what was going to happen, how was she going to deal with this, and so I just, yeah, really enjoyed this book, and I'm looking forward to reading the next one eventually. I think that the way that Holly Black kind of created the Fae in this world was really interesting, and just like that they're just very not human. They don't play by human rules, and that's part of the reason why some of the things they do are a bit abhorrent to us, but it's, you know, I guess just like a different sort of social norm, which is interesting, but also not great sometimes. But I think it really is good for that emotional investment that you have in Jude and her desire to succeed in this place. So yeah, I ultimately enjoyed this, and I would recommend it if you're looking for a kind of like Fae, political intrigue, coming of age, YA fantasy. It was a fun one. And then the last 2 books we have here, these were both favorites. I think these were both 5 stars, and I am really glad that I read them this month. And so the first one we have here is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. This book follows Lucia, a young, secretly Jewish woman who is a scullion maid living in Inquisition-era Spain. And obviously in this time, being anything but a good Catholic is liable to get you killed. So she has to hide her Jewish heritage and also just survive as a woman of no kind of like means or standing or anything in this place. So she works as a servant, and her mistress catches her performing these little miracles. So stuff like bread gets burned and she can make it unburnt, or there's a hole in a dress and she can mend it without a needle and thread. And so when her mistress realizes that she can perform these little miracles, she basically coerces Lucia into performing them for dinner guests as like a form of entertainment. And eventually word gets around that there's this magical scullion maid who can do these little tricks, and this gets the attention of some powerful players, and Lucia gets thrust into this competition competition with the hopes of impressing the King of Spain. As a housemaid, this is pretty much her only chance to ever be anything more than a housemaid, and so she goes along with it with the help of an immortal familiar. So I'd only ever read The Six of Crows duology from Leigh Bardugo, but I really, really loved that, and so I was almost kind of nervous to read this because this is definitely very different than the Grishaverse. It's historical fantasy, but I am happy to say that I love this so much. It was just so incredibly well done, and I think it might not be for everyone who is also like a, you know, Leigh Bardugo fan for Grishaverse stuff, but I do think it was just a really, really good book. So there are parts of this that really pulled at my heart, and I feel like what was masterful about this, I don't know if it was intentional, but I felt like maybe at the beginning Lucia felt perhaps like a bit of a bland character, kind of a blank slate. You didn't really know her very well, and so you're just like, why am I following, like, why do I care about this character? But then as we get through the book, you learn little bits about her and you start to care about her more, and I think that's like normal in every book, but I think it didn't really like hit me really quickly, that sort of connection to her, until we got farther in. And I think that that almost mirrors some of the ways that other characters in the book saw her, where they kind of overlooked her because she was a scullion maid, and so like really not worth noticing until they got to know her more, and then they were like, oh, you are like an interesting, impressive person. And so I don't know if that was intentional writing from Leigh Bardugo's point of view, but I enjoyed that part of the book. I also enjoyed Lucia's character. I enjoyed the other characters around her. And I think that one of the things that this book did really well was the different representations of women at the time. So we have Lucia, who's this scullion maid, and she doesn't have any kind of like money or standing or anything. But we also have POVs from like side characters, like her mistress, who is a noblewoman, but from a kind of like poor family, and like she's kind of poor by noblewoman standards. And she's very much stuck in this place and stuck at the whims of her husband and trying to keep up with the Joneses, but without a lot of actual resources to do so. And then we also have Lucia's aunt, who is the mistress to a very rich, powerful man, and she has to walk this line between trying to protect Lucia, but then also not angering the only source of income she has. And so it was a really interesting look into like these three women and how they handled, you know, just like living in this particular era in Spain. And I think that that was another just like interesting feature of this book, was the representation of different types of women and the kind of bonds that they have with each other and the relationships that they have with each other. Some of them were kind of adversarial, some of them were more connected, some of them were not as loving as you would hope they would be. And so it was just a really interesting and I think kind of honest look at what situations can do to people and how it can impact what I think our ideals of relationships might be. Anyway, I really enjoyed this. This is a really good book. I would definitely recommend it if you like historical fantasy, and yeah, just pick it up. It's wonderful. And then the last book we have here is The Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So in this book, we are following Emily. Emily is a gentlewoman in this fantasy world that's kind of like ours, and I kind of got like Little Women and Pride of Prejudice vibes in terms of like the setting and the time. I know those are different time periods, not really far apart, but like kind of. But like that's just what I was picturing when I was picturing Emily and like her sisters at the beginning of this book. So this book starts out with the start of a war. Emily lives in the kingdom of Lascaux, and their neighboring kingdom, Deadland, killed their king and then elected a parliament and then declared war on Lascaux because they couldn't stand to be neighbors with a kingdom, and they had to force everyone to have their republican values, is the kind of premise of this war. So it starts out like any typical war where there's a big recruiting drive and it's encouraged, it's an act of patriotism or whatever to serve, and so a bunch of men are swept up, including Emily's brother-in-law, who buys an officer rank and goes off to war. And then a few months go by, or years or whatever, and they're almost, you know, they've almost got this, but they just need a little bit more for a push. So they start a draft and they basically recruit all of the men, including Emily's little brother. And then a few more months or years go by, and we're almost winning. We've almost got them. We've almost really cinched the war, but we need more people. And so the government says we're going to start recruiting women, and so any household with more than 2 women in it has to donate one of their women to the war effort. So Emily decides to take on this role for her household, and she goes off to war. So this is a book that I wouldn't have usually thought I would like. It's, you know, about war, and it's about like a kind of, like I said, more I don't even know what you would call it, like colonial era, revolutionary era, Civil War era. I understand that those are like 100 years apart, but like that era of war, we're talking muskets and like cannons and cavalry and stuff like that in terms of the sort of weapons that are being used. And to be honest, the war part of this happened a couple hundred pages in. Like, we were relatively far into the book before Emily actually got sent off to war, so we got a lot of the build up to her actually going into the war. And I think that part of the power of this book was that it wasn't just about the war, it was about Emily's kind of journey and struggle and whatever as the war developed, as her brother-in-law got sent off, as her little brother got sent off, as she kind of had to try to like hold together her family, as they had to struggle with there being shortages of food. And then when she has to make this decision of going off to war, she, you know, develops a kind of autonomy that would have not been normal for the kind of like era that this is coded to be in. And so like the kind of dynamics and the social expectations of stuff of a young woman would not be that she would be any kind of military commander or have any kind of like power or autonomy or anything. And she really develops this, but like not in a very unrealistic way. And so that was really interesting, seeing her character development, seeing her in the stages before the war and then during the war and then after the war. And I think this explored a lot of different dynamics of war. There was the kind of like micro dynamics of the war and the people who were fighting it and how their choices and their actions impact the war. And then there's like the macro stuff and like why the war has started and the reasons behind that and the political stuff. And then there's also the side of like what happens to people who are not actively fighting in the war, people who are living in countries that are at war. And then there's also the, you know, after war. How do two countries who have been at war, when the fighting is done, like what happens? Where do they go? How do people move on? And that's a really interesting question and dilemma that pretty much every country in the world has had to deal with at one point or the other. So I really enjoyed how this book explored war. I really enjoyed how it explored her character. I really enjoyed how it explored the political elements of it. And I think that there are parts of this that almost felt a bit frustrating, where you're just like, how can certain characters like not get certain things? But then you're just like, well, would this character who's raised in this way, who has had these life experiences, like be immediately jumping to these conclusions? Like, probably not. So yeah, it was just a very interesting book, and I really liked what Adrian Tchaikovsky did with this. So I'm now really eager to pick up more of his books in the future, and I know he's written a ton of them. So if you've read any of Tchaikovsky's books, please feel free to recommend them to me down in the comments. But yeah, this was really good, and if you are interested in anything I've just talked about, I would highly recommend this book. I was very surprised by how much I liked it. So yeah, I hope that I will find other books of his that I enjoy as well. Okay, so those are all the fiction books I read in October. If you've read any of these books, feel free to let me know what you thought of them down below. If you read any books in October that you would like to shout out, feel free to also do that down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, and if you'd like to see more of me in the future, please subscribe. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are, and hope to see you in my next video. Thanks very much. Bye.